live stream. This week we've got DT Cochrane. DT is a senior economist at Canadian Labour. This is the second time he's been on our show, so he knows what he should expect. We're going to talk about taxes, more taxes, everything taxes. Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show.
Taxes and death. They're the two uncertainties, or they're actually the two certainties of basically structured societies. So we've got DT back in the studio today, and it's just DT and myself. We've got Steve Keane, who's off, and we've got Mike, who's also off. There's a little bit of family business going on and a little bit of career business. Steve's being pulled in a couple different directions, but he'll be back in a week or two. So I think what we want to do is I'm gonna thank everybody for showing up. We love you all. We want to give everybody their props that are supporting this channel. We want to encourage you, like we always do, to subscribe, to put your comments in, to follow us on Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, but X, or whatever Elon Musk is calling it these days. And we are also on LinkedIn, and we've got a higher, I believe it's a 1080p, video resolution that's going on. So that's all for you guys. Thank you. And, keep the comments streaming. We love to hear them, and we're going to engage with them. Oh, here we've got it all. Ty loves me. That's great. I love you too, Ty. And Dre Guy, he's been with us, I think, from day one, right? So greetings from the fellow empathetic survivalists. Oh man, I'm having some problems with the speech today. I think maybe I should have a big sip of coffee. Is it too early for a live stream? No. We're gonna do this well. Hey DT, why don't you come on into the studio and let's hear what you've got to say about some taxes, death, and that amazing suit that
Thank you once again for having me. I don't know if you remember the first time I was on, Dan, but you noted that you are also a DT, and you actually changed your screen name to
right.
DT Sanderson. So I was wondering if I would be greeted with the same. Since it's just the two of us, maybe for clarity's sake, you should remain Daniel. Happy to be back and having this conversation. It was noted that I'm now with the Canadian Labour Congress. The last time I was on, I was with Canadians for Tax Fairness. And one of the nice things about moving to the Canadian Labour Congress was that I get to think about things beyond tax. I mean, I loved thinking about tax, but it's just one kind of narrow component of the macroeconomy. And now I get to think about all of it, but still happy to talk about tax if that's where this conversation goes.
I hope so, but I mean, explain for the audience what you're like. It's an official role with the government, or are you a consultant that comes in and serves the government as a consultant exclusive for government policy? What's that role?
The Canadian Labour Congress is the largest labor organization in Canada, and we don't have members. We're not like a union. We have affiliates. Unions belong to the Congress, and it's existed for many decades now, and it does, among its many tasks, pressure the government to implement policies that are desired by the members of our affiliate union. So things that are good for labor broadly. And I am the new senior economist at the Congress. And so I do all sorts of analysis, broadly falling under the topic of macroeconomics. That said, one of the things I was hoping maybe we could talk about today is what I see as the need to develop a middle scale of economic analysis between the micro and the macro, and that's the mesoeconomic, because that's where I think a lot of the interesting economic processes are actually happening, and they get obfuscated when you try to look from a bottom-up micro or look down from the macro perspective. And probably I think the best current example of someone doing mesoeconomics is Isabella Weber, with her work that people might be familiar with on sellers inflation, is what her and her team have called it, and looked at how specific sectors of the economy have really been driving the recent bout of high inflation.
Sellers, say that again.
Sellers inflation. So
Sellers
it's
inflation.
really a more formal conceptual name for what has vernacularly been called greedflation. So basically, corporations taking advantage of economic turmoil to hike their markups and pad their profit margins. And certain sectors in particular, when they have that pricing power, given their place within the macroeconomy, that will affect the costs of many other sectors who, when they can, will respond in kind by passing along those costs. And when they can, passing along those costs plus some. So that's really been the most, I think, interesting and novelly accepted aspect of the recent bout of inflation, was that the people who set the prices that we see, they're setting them higher. That's what inflation is. It's not all, it's too much money, too few goods, blah, blah, blah. It is the people who have pricing power taking advantage of that pricing power.
Well, it's like, I mean, I like this. I mean, my questions have kind of changed, and then we get to this point where we're talking about monetary policy to control inflation. And that's kind of where I settled at, is that, are you saying that there's a flaw in the reaction of monetary policy to like control inflation? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
The central banks, if we're going to give central banks all due credit, they don't necessarily deserve it, but let's give them all due credit. When inflation was taking off, they had to do something, because even with a dual mandate, price stability is one of the dominant things they're supposed to do. And so once inflation is climbing, they have to do something. And there's really only one thing they can do, and that's hike interest rates. So central banks really did what they have to do. Was that the right policy response? Absolutely not, because interest rates are a demand side response, and this was a supply side inflation. It was, at the root, there were lots of material reasons for it, but then you had corporations taking advantage of all of the turmoil and these material reasons, like COVID, like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, like all of in Canada, we had, a series of natural disasters that obviously raised lots of production costs. But then you had corporations who weren't just passing along their own higher costs, they were increasing their markups, which then brought them, record high profits.
I'm gonna put something out there, and I'm gonna say, how do you balance your sights on corporate, as well as put a nice balance of critique on government structures? And so maybe let me elaborate a little bit on it. Is there a focus on industry and not a focus on government organizations that also have impregnated inefficiencies, cost overruns, these types of things? I mean, and I guess to maybe finish off that, to throw that back to you, is that there are corporations, like individual municipalities are run like corporations. So, they're not really looked at as a greedy, money-hungry corporation, but they are susceptible to the same type of, let's just, for the sake of it, call it like money grabs or expansion of budgets. How do you balance this? Are your sites primarily focused on industry and not so much government bloating. How do you balance the two of those in a fair critique?
Yeah, so it's absolutely a fair point. I would first, just some language clarification for how I view these things. One of my main inspirations is the early 20th century economist Thorstein Veblen. And one of his main theoretical offerings was the distinction between business and industry. And he saw industry as the domain of what he called workmanship. And this was the coordination of all of the moving parts to produce the things that we need to exist as a society. And then you had business situated on top of that, which he identified as the domain of sportsmanship. And this was the competitive domain. And from Veblen's perspective, business and its control of industry introduces sabotage, because it essentially requires the society at large to pay them a tribute in order to keep the products flowing to serve our needs. And they will grab the largest possible tribute that they can. So they actually keep industry from operating as efficiently and effectively as we would want if it's just about serving our needs, because they've made it serve their profit interests. So lots of people use industry and business interchangeably. I would use industry to talk about like the productive aspect of all of this, and then business to be like the financial layer that's also the decision-making layer within our private sector predominantly. Government definitely needs lots of critical examination. And we have, there's an entire discipline of political science that is more or less geared towards kind of critically examining political institutions, but we don't have the same sort of existing discipline to critically examine business institutions. Business school is largely about training people to do business things, and I have interacted with lots of business school people who do have a critical perspective on what business does, but we haven't developed these kind of more formal theories of how business functions, even though we see a lot of what it doesn't appear to be in the best interest of society. And so I definitely want to keep a focus on government, but we need much more critical examination of business, because corporations have become undeniably powerful, and they're operating in the interest of a fairly small elite who own by far the overwhelming majority of the equity.
Yeah. So we're going down a pathway of an equitable distribution of wealth, and so that's really interesting and telling. That fills in a lot of gaps for me in terms of your approach. I'm gonna pull up the top chatters list. So I'm gonna give a run through it, and just to give you a heads up, DT, you've been here before, and so around midway, about an hour into the show, it's going to be your turn. So the only thing I'm going to say, the bar is pretty low, because all you got to do is do it better than me. Is that fair?
Well, I watched Jim Stanford's episode, and he received so much praise, and Jim is a very important figure in my life. So I at least have to live up to Jim's performance.
Oh, he surprised the heck out of us. Yeah, but anyways, okay, Julia, let's throw that up and let's see what we got. Oh, look, it can't be that small. That's so funny. Like, what's going on there, Ty? You ran out of time or what? We got Santi, Dregai, John Watson, Nicholas Gomez, Dregai, Owen Wall, Ghost on a Half Shell, Joe Polito, Rick O'Brien, Danger Zone, KJ79, DJ Ango Geek, TR Blue Bay, Larry Summers, David Collins, D. Smith, Wayne McMillan, J. Bay 088, Bill Goggin, Andrei, Kesinofatov, Read the Deficit Myth. That's a subliminal message there. Or not subliminal, it's a direct message. Guys, go read the Deficit Myth. Jim Roberts, Big Hammer, Lana Dell Hates the Clock, Tony Wilson, DJ Uju, and Johnny. Come on. Oh, I got it. Yeah, the coffee's helping. Whoever said that in the beginning was like, you know what, coffee helps. And it's like, I feel like, I mean, it's not like a feeling of drunkenness coming to the studio and being the host. What it actually is, it's like, just getting into that rhythm. And, we're going to have a lot of fun for the balance of this. I'm going to throw a kind of a litany of questions at you. And I think they're, they're meant for a little bit of rapid fire. Okay, DT. I mean, I'm going to say, give me two of your biases that project that you feel that you project out in the world. Like what are your biases? I mean that's a fair question. How do you contend with them, and where do you find your sympathies?
This is really the perfect question. I was looking at the chat while you were reading the names, and Michael D'Souza Cruz made a comment that gets at one of my biases and maybe a change in my thinking at the moment. So he wrote, corporations are creatures of the state. I would slightly correct that to say they're creatures of government, but anyway, corporations are agents of the government. When you realize that corporations are another branch of government, then it all makes sense. And I both agree and disagree with Michael. And yes, corporations absolutely are legal entities, and they depend on governments, which remain the monopoly power over lawmaking. At the same time, corporations have, in going transnational, not escaped government, but have escaped particular governments to a degree. Now, the US really can sanction any corporation they want at any time, and they can come up with the reason and the legal justification to do so if they want. So it's not just a clear-cut government.
Before we start picking on the U.S., why the U.S.? Out of all countries, is it because they're the benevolent dictator, the top of the heap? What
yeah, they're the
was it that brought the U.S. in front of mind? I mean, we're Canadians, right? And you're Canadian, I'm Canadian.
Yeah.
What is it about the U.S. that says, hey, they get special treatment, and they can sanction corporations? What is it? Is it the kind of thing that other countries don't have? That is it a participation in an agreement in international law? Please clarify that.
Yeah, it's their hegemonic role. It's them as the major international legal force. I'm not an expert in international law, but just knowing U.S. international history, they can't do whatever they want, but they can do many things that other countries can't do just by force of their financial power, their military power, and I think a moral authority that they retain in many people's eyes. You can see polls, even from countries that have directly been the target of US force, and there will still be shockingly high positive perspectives on the United States. So that power, I think, is largely undeniable, and part of it does allow them to call corporations to heel when they wish to do so. And for the most part, they don't, as long as those corporations aren't directly contravening their broader interests. And we can get into debates about exactly what those interests are. I'm not really that interested in kind of parsing all of that. Getting back to
let's stay away from the US. But my feeling is that you've got a focus on labor. So I'm imagining that cross-border trade comes into a situation, yes. And when you put your hand up, you're there saying, hey, wait a minute, there's labor is really important. So decimating industries and affecting families, working families in Canadian working families is something that, as a sovereign country, we want to be, we want, I guess, more legal autonomy, I guess would be the right word, to protect ourselves against that threat from people outside of our sovereignty. Is that another form of the bias and the trajectory, the moral ground that you stand on?
Yeah, it's I would say my biases are generally corporations are going to harm us when that's in the best interest of their bottom line, and that unions have been one of the most important sources of checking corporate power and pushing back on the harmful actions of corporations. On my first appearance, I actually mentioned that taxation and unionization have tended to be the two main ways that we've checked corporate power. I would now also say regulation done right, and street activism. That people organizing in the streets have also introduced some checks on corporate power. And I also have a bias that labor is better than business. And I'm here to defend the interest of labor because as I see things right now, the balance of power is so wildly out of whack. The mobility of corporations, their ability to kind of play different groups against each other, the amount of say they have within government, getting back to the how much does government need to be critiqued. A lot of my critique of government is how beholden it is to corporate interests. So yeah, those are my biases. I was trained, I have a PhD and thought of myself as being a scientist. And so I still try to look at the world in what I see as being a truthful way. I want to describe the world as it actually is. And I'm certainly not going to claim that unions have never done a bad thing. There are unions that fight against each other, and I would pick sides in some of those fights sometimes. When Jim was on, Jim Stanford was on, Steve brought up, an example of workers, literally throwing the union boss over a fence because they were so sick and tired of how the union bosses had been acting. And any institution is prone to being captured and corrupted. I would say that unions, for whatever failings they have, every institution have more of a commitment to democratic oversight than almost any other major institutional form that I can think of. And anytime you're participating in an organization with a commitment to democracy, it can be frustrating at times, but most people who belong understand how essential it is. And I think that one of the things we should be taking from unions beyond the policies that we're advocating for, which are to try to rebalance the power towards workers, is as a model of democratic oversight, because they are struggling with this and much more, flattened out than other hierarchical institutions.
So when you're working with the government, do they look at how you show up and present yourself as somebody who's more in a kind of derivative of an NDP sort of? Because like a labor-centric party, I mean, there's those kinds of political parties all over the world, right? So, it's not that you're, the central focus on being labor and protecting labor is not, it's not the priority in a conservative party, and it's not the priority in a liberal party, but it definitely is a priority in a labor party. So, is that some like? When they invite DT to the party and you're part of policy forming, are they also bringing other people into the party to advise from their perspective? Because you've kind of like staked your claim and said, here I am, I'm representing labor. And so it is not the entire picture is what I'm trying to say, DT, right? So how does that unfold when policy's coming into play?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I would say it's a concern that I have, how I am perceived being a labor economist. And am I allowed to comment on broad economic processes, macroeconomic phenomenon, things that are happening, that aren't immediately a labor issue and respected as an economic commentator in the same way that an economist from one of the major banks might be. So if you read any economic story, there will often be commentary from bank economists that it's not presented that, well, here's someone who's commenting who obviously is serving the interest of capital because they are a spokesperson of, an inherently capitalist entity. And I don't think we necessarily get the parity. And I don't think a bank economist is necessarily, purely spouting, some given capitalist line, not least because there's all kinds of differential capitalist lines. At the same time, I should immediately be written off as, oh, well, all he's going to have to say is propaganda. I do serious, empirically driven
I didn't say
economic analysis.
You dug a little bit of a deeper hole there, right? I mean, I didn't say
yeah,
that.
It's touching on an immediate concern that I have right now. How much do I need to fight against a perception of bias that economists working in more orthodox roles don't have to fight against?
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. I mean, I think the best defense is the laws of the land, where the preamble is we the people. So we the people create the laws, right? And then we abide by those laws as a group. And I like the pathway into this to say, hey, are the laws still reflective of what makes sense for Canadians, for Americans, for Australians, for New Zealanders? That's kind of, that's I think what for me, that's how I would kind of parse it and make sense of it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'm at root, I would say I'm a Democrat, a small D Democrat, in a very kind of vernacular, popular understanding of that it should be, the people who are deciding what this country is going to do, what any institution that they're a part of, how it's going to act, what interests it's going to serve, how it's going to do that. Doing that always is easier said than done. You want to avoid kind of majoritarianism, which obviously can be very destructive for members of minority groups. And we have developed various checks and balances on that. I think we the people make the laws. It's that making the laws is the key component of that our society is, well, we have made it. It's not been, this is not God-given. It's our collective autonomies combining to create the institutions that then kind of create boundaries for how we can act. Yeah, I think the central question of all social sciences is what's the relationship between the individual and the collectives that they are a part of, and how do we balance the interests of those two parts? That institutions only exist because of the individuals that are parts of them, and individuals only exist because of the many institutions that they are a part of. So it's paradoxical. There's no way of reducing one to the other. The individual can't be reduced to the collectives, and the collectives can't be reduced to the individuals. And that makes this all very, very tricky to parse.
What do you think Ghost is saying here when he says, wait, but Friedman says we only have separate interests? We're all individual interests? Is that what she's saying?
That would certainly be one way of trying to interpret it. And if Ghost on the Half Shell means Milton Friedman, that's what I would understand it to be. Like, we're just radically selfish individuals. One of my favorite books of philosophy is Deleuze's book on Hume called Empiricism and Subjectivity. And Deleuze's reading of Hume is that Hume observes the problem is not that people are wholly selfish and self-interested. If that were the case, we really could then just negotiate and figure out how to balance those interests. The problem is that people's interests are partial, meaning they extend beyond ourselves to our immediate family, to our ethnic group, to our brothers and sisters and non-binary others within our nations. Like there's some limits to that. And so as a selfish person, you could pay me to give certain things up.
Yeah.
I'm not going to die on my own behalf. I'm not going to kill on my behalf. I will die and kill for my children. And there are people who will die and kill for their ethnic group. And there are people who will die and kill for their country. It's that partiality of interest that really makes this difficult. And so trying to reduce society to just an aggregate, the Thatcher, Bentham, there is no such thing as society, is obviously total horseshit. We're not just an aggregate of individuals, because even within our families, we know this family is more than just the sum of its parts.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I like the horseshit comment. That's great. You threw me off because I had a question loaded in the gun, and I was like,
I'm sorry.
The horseshit just got
last time I was given kudos / maybe a bit of a slap on the wrist for how much I swore. So I told Ty,
no, keep going.
Try to keep it a little bit in check.
I mean, and you wear the suit because it's like, well, it's business time, right? It's like time to go to work, right?
Yeah.
You got to be professional, and
that's right.
We were talking off air, and you said, well, there's one thing I don't want to talk about because it's, I'm not going to bring it up other just in reference to it, but horseshit and swearing and everything, that's all good, but some of these other things we'll just stay away from those. I do have a burning question because the worship of the union is something that I think as a capitalist and not a wholly capitalist, but I'm the owner of a corporation, and I know how frustrating it is to herd cats, basically. And so I want you to just explore this for me, right? Like when does a union understand that they're actually the malignant part of the corporation, right? Like when they're no longer performing, when they're no longer holding responsibility, when they're no longer holding up their end of the bargain, and it's actually destroying the corporation. Like, how do you separate that, right? It's not, because there's multiple parties and people involved, and how do you then push something back onto the unions and say, guys, you know what, you can only take so far, to the point where you throw your hands up and go, I might as well just, as the capitalist, just roll in, like, what is the thing? Like, just like surrender the corporation and say, I don't know what to do. Like I have given all the power away, and the direction and the leadership of the corporation is so uncompetitive in the marketplace that you're destroying the whole company. You're destroying the whole structure of work, production, and output. So I mean, like, how do you square that circle?
No one wants to destroy. I mean, if we can again use this business industry distinction, no worker wants to destroy the industry that they're contributing to and that is providing them with work. Unions negotiate on behalf of their members, and they're trying to get the best possible deal they can get for their members, knowing that there are obviously limits to what can be done when negotiating with this single business. Typically, what would be looked for is, transparency. Show us, because for lots of good reasons, unions and their members don't simply trust their employer when they're claiming, oh, we can't afford to do that. I'm not involved in bargaining, so I don't directly undertake that kind of relationship. So I'm not, I will defend the vital importance of unions. And if one unionized workplace is struggling against non-unionized workplaces, the most important thing to do is to unionize those other workplaces. And I don't know if you saw Angus Deaton's recent kind of mea culpa, come to Jesus moment. So Angus Deaton is, a pseudo Nobel Prize winner in economics. So fully from the, neoclassical side of things. And put out this piece recently saying I'm revisiting a lot of the things that I believed at one point and recognizing how myself and my brethren are incorrect. And the first thing was power. Power is absolutely everywhere within the economy. My PhD supervisor, Jonathan Nitzen, him and his writing partner, Shimshon Bickler, have theorized that capitalist value is an expression of power. So this obviously really speaks to me and is the way that I think about economic relationships. And it's not going away. We can't compete it away. And if power is not going away, we need to figure out how to check it, how to balance it, how to keep one interest from growing so powerful it can immiserate all of the rest. And at the moment, unions are not the powerful entity that's destroying the rest of the country. They're the ones who are, keeping a modicum of power on the side of the workers compared to capital.
That's interesting. I was talking to a friend that is through and through a capitalist, and basically he's somebody that's he was a Polish immigrant. He came over to Canada in the 80s, and it was a tough road, right? He worked hard and he got built up a factory, and he's an incredibly skilled. He's a genius. He's an absolute genius when it comes to production and making products, right, for the construction industry. One thing that was really interesting is that he remembers a time in a communist regime, and let's spend some time talking about communal structures versus capitalist structures. But he made the very striking point as a capitalist that in the rebuilding time of Poland, the output in a communist regime for Poland was incredibly productive. They rebuilt a country very quickly and so what are your thoughts on that when people start to as we kind of go into this dichotomy of capitalist versus communist theory?
I would look at this via the business industry distinction of Veblen. And I recently toured the Ford plant in Dearborn, Michigan, and it's a shadow of its former self. But anytime I see large scale industrial production, it really is my God, like the things that we are capable of. I'm a middle-aged dad, and becoming a middle-aged dad has turned me to middle-aged dad things such as more and more interest in World War II, just fascinated by World War II. And one of the things I most marvel at is the scale of production to undertake this war. When you see footage of any of the landings on D-Day and just the mass of industrial products that were designed, created, and then produced
and coordinated, right? Coordinated was
this coordinated production. That's exactly right. Veblen's big thing was industry is the domain of coordination because you need things to operate smoothly. You don't want to be spot negotiating with your suppliers at the cargo doors every single morning. You have long-term contracts. We're going to have these supplies coming in so we can promise our customers delivery at a certain time. All of that needs to be coordinated. And workers obviously are an essential piece of that coordination. And when people start, I'll say businesses in the vernacular sense, often they're coming from the industrial side of things as well. They've gained some sort of knowledge, or they see some sort of niche, or they know that they could do things more efficiently. And so they have this industrial knowledge. And these are sort of the captain of industry types who they're now in the business side, but they know the industry side. But increasingly, the people who are on the business side, they don't even necessarily know all of the industrial goings on. And their interest is just that bottom line in the interest of the owners of the company. And that's often best served not by greater efficiency, but by actually sabotaging and limiting the productive efficiency, which then undermines this large scale, impressive, coordinated, standardized thing that we are capable of doing. So you have the impressive feat of the production for World War II. And then when you see the destruction and how quickly places were recovered, it's mind-boggling to me. And that's the power of collective labor. So that needs to be reinvigorated. And we're seeing it with more and more people openly talking about industrial planning, industrial policy. Planning is still a dirty word. You're not allowed to say planning. Industrial policy is recognizing we need to be thinking about these things and not just, well, what will the private sector do that will ensure we get the best possible outcome?
Yeah, but going back to the point, like with inflation and added costs, added bureaucracy, policy, planning, whatever you want to call it, it's ultimately going to filter down and it costs the individuals more. Is that not the case? I mean, like, the corporations are always going to protect their bottom line. They're in business for making profit. So does that, if the landscape changes through policy, doesn't that mean that the end users are going to pay more? Public's going to pay more for the inefficiencies?
I don't think it's a given like that. I don't think that's a given at all. I started, when you asked about the biases, I mentioned this comment that Michael de Souza Cruz made about corporations being the creature of government, and that this is something I've been kind of revisiting. And I've been revisiting it because I've always just thought of corporations as the corporation as a malevolent legal structure. But tax was created for malevolent purposes. Tax was created for powerful forces to extract surplus from surrounding populations to feed the military class. I'm caricaturing things a little bit, but roughly that's. But tax got captured by the public to turn it to positive purposes. It's a way of public provisioning for our interests, even though its origins were for negative, harmful purposes. So I'm increasingly thinking, okay, the corporation, are there aspects of that legal form that are useful and should be leveraged back into serving the public purpose? So last time I mentioned this book by Seth Klein, A Good War, in which
you got to put it down, and I want you to go into your settings and flip the setting from mirror to whatever, because no one will be able to read that book.
Okay.
Unless they've got some sort of really
settings.
I don't know, some sort of
video.
Interesting
mirror
brain
camera.
That can, there you go. A Good War. Okay. Well,
Okay,
I like the so you're off to a good start. You're pairing good with war. So I mean, let's see. It's Seth Klein. Okay.
Seth
Mobilizing Canada. Okay, let's hear what.
So it's as I mentioned last time, he takes seriously the metaphor that often gets thrown around for dealing with the climate crisis of World War II. Specifically, what did Canada do for World War II, and how can we learn from that for the climate crisis? And the big takeaway is public investment. It was, the public government, federal government specifically, just poured tons of money into production of what we needed to fight the war effort. But they also made heavy use of crown corporations. So these were sort of arm's length entities, not fully arm's length, obviously. The government still had a lot of, oh my God, Jim, you're hurting my feelings.
Well, the thing was they put the mirror in there so that you look more like yourself when you're looking at the screen. But come on, right? I mean, look at DT's. He's good. He's like a GQ guy. Look, he's got the beard. He's got the, he's got the glasses. He's got the, is it a little bit like a madman look or madman?
Except
throwback sort of thing.
Yeah, except they're all a bunch of assholes. So I aspire to be not an asshole, but dressed nicely. Yeah, and I totally get the that now the wrong side of my face is lit. It's also weird for me because if I'm too close to one side, it's like, oh, I want to get back to the middle, but then I try to go the same way to go back to the
Oh
middle.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
okay. Oh, am I mirrored again?
No, I just threw
No.
you over on the other
Oh,
side.
threw me on the other side. Okay. Back to the topic of leveraging the corporation.
Oh, guys, you know what you're witnessing? We just threw a curveball to DT. I just kind of, short circuited his brain there for a minute, right? We were on a really great.
Oh, right.
Yeah, we're really good here, right? So
right. We're talking
before we do this. I know you got a thing, but I think we're on such a good tax climate. Look at what's happening in Canada. Polyev is going to call a special election for what? What? We have an aversion to tax. So if the will of the people is like, fuck the tax, how do you, like, come on, like, help me out with this? Like, you've got an entire policy that's going to have, I'm guessing, I'm not saying I'm a Polyev guy, but I think he's 60-70% majority government. He's going to absolutely destroy, and he's going to annihilate the tax because nobody wants it. So help me out, DT. This is what you were referring to earlier, like the tyranny of the majority. What is going on? This is a whole mess. Go.
Okay, perfect. I shared a bunch of visualizations just in case something came up. So there's one that I shared called Climate Policy Pyramid that I would like to share with folks.
Sure.
There we go. That's it.
Wow.
So this is from the 2023 federal budget, and it's describing the government's policy approach to dealing with the climate crisis. And you can see that the base of the pyramid is pollution pricing and regulatory framework. So that includes the carbon tax, the carbon price. And then you have these investment tax credits. And after the last budget, when I was with my previous employer, we talked about these a lot. So those are, sit on top of this base. So the carbon tax is the base of their whole approach, investment tax credits, then strategic finance, and finally targeted programming. This is a market-driven approach. And the government in Budget 2023 says specifically, we are taking a market-oriented approach to dealing with the climate crisis. And from my perspective, this is exactly wrong. This is like trying to take a market-oriented approach to fighting World War II. It would have been an absolute disaster. To my way of thinking, this pyramid needs to be flipped on its head. So I'm a supporter of carbon prices. Putting a price on carbon, to me, makes sense. You shouldn't be able to just freely dispose of emissions into the atmosphere. It's led to all kinds of perverse overdevelopments and underdevelopments within our economy. It was really a massive, massive subsidy that has benefited most of us that live in the West who have, fairly high emission lifestyles. We have been beneficiaries of this, but much, much more so, obviously, those who are at the top of our economic hierarchy. They've been the big winners of this. So put a price on carbon, but it should be the top piece, because the market should not be the foundation of this. We need public investment because the private sector is just not going to do it for all kinds of different reasons, no matter how much you try to incentivize them to do so.
Does modern monetary policy come into play where we don't have to spend so much time in the government in a government conversation of bickering between how things are going to be paid? Is that, would you say that we could mobilize quickly and fund initiatives on a grand scale through an adoption of a modern monetary policy and basically an open checkbook?
So I have an op-ed drafted that hopefully will be coming out soon, which is trying to preempt the deficit and debt conversation that I know is coming. So the federal budget is going to be April 16th. So both before and after that, we're going to hear lots of Chicken Little squawking about how the debt sky is falling and it's going to destroy all of us. It is a massive distraction. It's At the very least, it's based on ignorance about how our fiscal structures work. And at worst, it's deliberately meant to distract us from the difficult conversations we actually need to have about the real crises we do face. We don't face a fiscal crisis because, as MMT has really popularized, monetarily sovereign governments can spend all of the money that they need to spend. They don't need to get it from somewhere in order to do so. And where this does become a concern is really processes of fiscal management. How much money do we need to leave in the economy? Where is that money ending up? And so where do taxes need to be applied in order to bring that money back into public hands? Because it can create risks of inflation, the best known ones, but also, and I used this metaphor last time, it is a form of dry powder in the hands of the wealthy elites who tend to grab the concentrated bulk of these financial resources when they're put into the economy. We have seen it with the pandemic spending. The federal government introduced hundreds of billions of additional dollars into the economy in order to support the Canadian population. They did so in lots of flawed ways, but the act itself was essential and really kept people, put a floor under people from the free fall of, if they had lost their jobs and these supports weren't there, the disaster that would have been. But that money has been grabbed just transaction by transaction. Every little bit of profit margin, every increase in markup just saw more and more of that money ending up in corporate hands and them sending it to their owners, who are disproportionately those who already have the most. So when government does spend this way, it has a tendency to find its way into the hands of the powerful. It's really kind of obvious. You don't have to, read deep Marxist theory in order to get this. It just makes sense because of the power that exists within our economy. So during World War II, they implemented really high marginal tax rates at the top end of things, and they had a 100% excess profit tax with a 20% rebate after the war. So if your profits go up, then once we win the war, then the companies can have 20% of the excess profits rebated back. So that's still an 80% excess profit tax. Profits in Canada.
Well, explain that to me, because I'm like, step me through that, because I want to say that I'm a owner of a manufacturing facility that adapts my production output to make products for the war.
Yeah.
And you're the representative of the government, and you come to me and you say what, in terms of, like, sketch that out for me and what that 20% means, because I hear what you're saying, but I didn't really understand what that meant.
So your company has been operating, let's say, with a 6% profit margin, and then wartime comes, and the government is saying, we're gonna buy everything that you're producing because it's essential to the war effort. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And suddenly you're making a 20% profit margin, which you're able to do because you're exercising, well, I have this stuff that you absolutely want, so you'll pay whatever I want you to pay. And so now you
can buy my capacity because I'm like 6%, 20%. The math is obvious. I'm going to switch my capacity and move in the direction of 20%. Okay. Yeah.
So all of the profit that you made from that higher profit margin, that was completely taxed back. You were allowed to keep the 6% that you were making before. So they weren't seeking to immiserate these companies.
Wait a minute. It sounded so good.
It was
but you're telling me you're going to tax me 14%.
That excess profit, everything above the 6% margin,
okay. We're going to
that will all get taxed
6%.
back,
okay.
But you'll get 20% of the excess back after the war. So once the war is done, then it will only be at 80%. But during the wartime, it was 100% excess profit tax, because it was recognizing that It's not.
We got to win the war. We have to win the war. You're going to get your 6%. We're going to take all that extra after the war. Then okay, all right.
Yeah, and there's a bit of the. I don't love the term greedflation, because I'm very critical of corporations, but I try not to make moral judgments about them because they're doing the thing they were designed to do. They're designed to serve the interests of their owners. It's really a breach of their fiduciary duty not to try to exercise their pricing power. And so in the context of all of the turmoil that we've seen in the global economy and the ability to, well, I can pass along costs plus some, when they can do that, they're doing the thing they have to do. But we as the public don't have to just sit back and take it. And during the war, the government wasn't just going to sit back and let these companies exercise their pricing power, jack up their margins, and make huge profits. I mean, we call it war profiteering. It absolutely exists, and we need policies as a check on it. We have seen pandemic profiteering, and we've done sweet fuck all to address it. Canadian corporations have made, depending what measure you want to use, about $600 billion in excess profits. $600 billion in excess profits. Actually, did I share? No, didn't send along. Because the markup that corporations add on top of their costs of operating has jumped from about 11.5% before the pandemic to 15%. So with their rising costs at a constant markup, they still would have seen record profits. But they didn't just keep their existing markup, they boosted their markup. And so they've had this $600 billion in excess. If they would have just kept their markup at 11%, they would have seen the highest profits ever. They've made $600 billion in addition to that. That works out to about $16 billion per month over the last 3 years. There just happened to be about 16 million households in Canada. So basically every household in Canada has been sending 1,000 extra dollars to corporations month after month after month. And that was corporations taking advantage of what was happening during the pandemic, seeing all of this excess profit, and then they're just getting to keep it. And we're having all of this freak out about the government debt, and I think most of it is misplaced. But if we're really concerned about it, that's the money we should be going for, because it wasn't earned. It was just taken as an exercise of the pricing power that they have.
You know, DT, we're going to talk a little bit about, I don't want to point fingers at specific corporations, but I want to talk about a typical framework of what the corporations look like, okay? And then we'll go through several, maybe 3 or 4 different examples. But now's the time. Get ready for it.
Oh, okay. Another drink of water. Get my...
Yeah, you got to get your
red leather, yellow leather,
going.
Red leather, yellow leather. Unique New York.
Here we go. All right. Okay. Here we go. Go.
Santi, Dragai, John Watson, Nicholas Gomez, Dragai, Owen Wall, Ghost on the Half Shell, Joe Polito, Rick O'Brien, Danger Zone, KJ79, Django Geek, TR, Blue Bay, Larry Summers, hey Larry, David Collins, D. Smith, Wayne McMillan, J Bay 088, Bill Goggin, Andrei Xenofontov, I am sorry, Andrei, Read the Deficit Myth, Jim Roberts, Big Hammer, Lanadell Hates the Clock, Tony Wilson, Juju, Johnny.
Okay, wait for it. Come on, where's our crowd on the couch?
Ooh,
they fall asleep.
They're not impressed with my efforts. At least I didn't get booze.
Yeah, well, it might be coming. Okay, so here's the goal. Here's the goal. I'd like to say we've got a corporation on the bottom, which could be similar to a single person corporation, okay? And then on the high side, you have
Voice of God breaking in here. Sorry, but somehow I got muted. Voice of God.
Oh, I see. Okay, well then let's hear the booze or the praise. What did we get?
AI is very happy.
Yeah, AI is really happy. Okay, we're going to move on. So I want to say that there's let's talk about the different. I don't know if Julia is it just in my. I'm sorry, guys. I can't really under. Okay, so we look at a corporation, a simple corporation of like 1 to 5 people. Okay, then there's the mega corporation that is like an enormous corporation. So in your work, how do you differentiate between these different forms of corporations, and do the rules change or your recommendations change based off of the size of the corporations?
Yeah. So the last major thing I did at Canadians for Tax Fairness was put out a report on climate and taxes. And it included a bunch of tax policy recommendations. And one that we kind of made tentatively was to have a progressive tax on corporations as a way of trying to put some downward pressure on concentration and the power that comes along with becoming really big. It's not, to my knowledge, there is no jurisdiction that has progressive taxation similar to how it's done in personal income tax size. We do have like a preferential small business tax. We have other sorts of preferential tax treatments that can create some distinctions based on size, but just a pure, we have brackets and the marginal rate increases with each of those brackets. It's not something that I have the time to really delve into, but I do think it's worth considering. I think it's a way of addressing concentration without overly valorizing competition. I'm always a little bit hesitant about overly focusing on competition as the way of checking corporate power. I'll often use the example of, I don't know if you remember when Loblaws pushed back against Frito-Lay for wanting to increase the price of chips that Loblaws was selling in their stores, and Loblaws said no. And so for a little while, there were no Frito-Lay chips on the in the stores owned by Loblaws. And eventually that all got resolved. We don't get to know exactly how it was resolved, but I'll make the point that you needed a company the size of Loblaws to push back against a Frito-Lay, which is also a big, powerful company. If Loblaws was just shattered into a bunch of neighborhood mom and pop grocery chains, they wouldn't have been able to push back against a Frito-Lay. So it sometimes takes a big, powerful corporation to check another big, powerful corporation. Now, Loblaw wasn't doing that in our interests. Of course, they spun it that way, but they were doing it in their own interests. But it would have served our interests by them checking this other big, powerful corporation. So we need ways of checking corporate power that aren't just like competition. Let's make sure that they compete. And I think putting some downward pressure on concentration by having higher marginal rates, it's at least worth thinking about. Maybe someone has an immediate reason, well, this is why that wouldn't work. I haven't heard one. Any of the objections have all been pretty facile.
Well, one thing that I grapple with is that larger corporations that are on a public market basically fill the portfolios of the rich and the elite, yes, but they also fill the portfolios of average working class people, teachers unions. The market and the investment that is built into the system, okay, is funding retirement plans for average middle class individuals. And there's corporations, and then there's the dividends that are paid to the middle class. And so like that's a concern for me, is that if you continually tax, and then you take away the ability for the corporations to be able to offer profits and dividends that ultimately end up into the marketplace in instruments that are I guess like in the market, you got to remember that's where our dollars are, right? I mean, it's not just equity in homes; it's actually mutual funds, retirement funds, returns from fossil fuel companies are really funding the middle class in terms of their retirements, and like that's a challenge too. What are your thoughts on that? If we, I mean, like basically, what are your thoughts on how that actually the money gets dispersed into the markets and spread through the markets through the mechanisms of finance and dividends and all of those kinds of instruments?
Yeah, this is a tricky area in terms of the getting from here to there, with the there being that everyone after their working life is done is adequately supported. They have there's no deprivation among retirees, and they can live a life that I think we all would like our elders to be able to live after they've made their contributions. And the way we do so now is through pensions that exist as large pools of capital operating within financial markets, just like any other large pool of capital. And that's the worst thing anyone has ever said about me. Even worse than just being told I don't look as good. Lex Friedman.
Wait a minute, you don't like Lex? I mean, he's great. What's the?
Maybe it's just me, but I feel like the smugness just radiates off of him, and
Okay.
I battle that in myself, and so if smugness is radiating off of me, I definitely need to check something. Yeah, and so right now, yeah, our retirees are. And I pay into a pension, and when I retire, I will be drawing on those pension funds that went into these large pools. And there are some perverse outcomes from that, where you have teachers unions whose pension plans own equity in private education institutes that are lobbying to cut funding for public schooling. You get these sorts of perversions that we rebel against. I don't have the here's what we should do to reform how pensions operate. In the Canadian context, this topic is heating up a little bit because you saw a bunch of Canadian business leaders, as well as some labor leaders, including Jim Stanford, who is a very important intellectual inspiration for me. They wrote a letter saying the government needs to make public pensions invest more in Canada. The basic reasoning being that you have all of this capital, it could get put to use in Canada towards some of the good things that we're wanting to see. I would say skeptical at the very least, because I feel like it's an unnecessary substitute once again for the public investment that should be made in the things that we need to see developed. It shouldn't be regulating this quasi-privately controlled capital to come into the country to then become cheap borrowing for existing corporations whom I'm already quite skeptical of. But people are thinking about how should these pension funds be used in ways that are actually beneficial to all of us, and not just the greatest possible return, which is what their fiduciary duty is, when that greatest possible return can be served by continuing to invest in fossil fuel extraction programs.
Yeah, but I'm confused. I mean, it takes something like the longshoremen, right? I mean, it's a bit of a mafia to get into that, and once you are, it's they're in for their own. They're negotiating for their own interests, similar to what a corporation would do, not for the greater good of society. They're in it for what is in it for me, right? I mean, and that's the frustrating thing, is to be able to say, well, where is the line, right? I mean, do it for the greater benefit of overall society. Okay, that's one line. And then do it for the overall benefit of the world. That's another line. It's just it's a blur to oblivion, and it's hard to say how far out should you to make the greater good. And that's the problem that I think that policy just has a hard time grabbing onto. Would you agree with that, or what? I mean, am I just
this is
equipped to...
this is exactly back to the Deleuze's Hume. The problem is not that we're selfish; it's that our interests are partial. It's what are the boundaries of where our interests go to. You know, Smith talked about this very insightfully in why can't I remember the name of his other book, The Moral. You're a philosopher.
The Butcher Baker thing, right? Like,
well, that's from The Wealth of Nations. Anyways, it will come to me. His other book, his Non-Wealth of Nations book, and says basically that, you know, a person cares more
Theory
about
of world sentiments. No. Okay.
Theory of moral sentiments. Theory of moral sentiments. Yes, you're right. That was it. Theory of moral sentiments. Thank you.
That was Julia.
It says basically that we care about an injury to our own thumb than we care about a population halfway around the world being wiped out. Now, yes and no. We see kind of perverse expressions of this all the time, where, you know, the missing blonde white girl gets, you know, around the clock coverage, where when a young black child goes missing, it's a blip, because it's playing on sentiments that we have and the extension of where our interests go to, or the interests of the dominant class go to. So I would always kind of at the, you know, top level say, we want to think universally. We want to think globally. That's harder to enact in terms of what are the actual policies that we're pursuing. Just returning to the tax side of things, you just saw this week that the United Nations is going to put out a model wealth tax, because taxation, a UN taxation framework, is being developed as a substitute for really the failed effort at a global tax framework coming out of the OECD. And this is long overdue. We allowed corporations to globalize without having in place the global regulatory mechanisms that we needed, especially on taxation. And this has, you know, created a lot of problems. And so more global governance, at risk of sounding like some crass globalist, I think we absolutely need to see more global governance of the things that actually affect the entire globe.
I'm going to ask you this, and then when we return to the global order talk, I want to ask the damning critique. I'll save this for later. The damning critique, in my opinion, is it's not a democratically elected structure, and there's a loss of publicly elected figures on a world stage. That's been one of the biggest coherent critiques that I've heard on the globalist agenda. But before we get into that, let's focus on Lana's question here. Dan, would you ask DT how he feels about Mosler's proposal to eliminate the FICA tax, also Randall Wray getting rid of corporate taxes and moving that elsewhere? He said, tax bad, not tax bad. So it's you know, the morality issue, not goods. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say one of the areas where the MMTers go wrong is on taxation. We talked about taxes quite a bit on my first visit, understandably. I was coming from Canadians for Tax Fairness. And I think there's okay, so MMTers love to cite this Beardsley, is that his name? He was a Fed official, had this article called "Taxes for Revenue Are Obsolete." And it's wrong. Taxes for revenue are not obsolete, even for monetarily sovereign entities. So yes, Canada can create all of the money it needs in order to fund the things that it needs to fund. If we can get a little bit nerdy and talk about the etymology of revenue, revenue just means to return, to bring the money back. So
yeah.
Taxes for revenue are exactly the purpose of taxes. It's to keep money coming back from not just continually piling up within the private sector where it can be inflationary and it becomes dry powder in the hands of powerful entities that can harm us in all sorts of different ways. And so we need that money to return to the public. So taxes for revenue absolutely are not obsolete. Taxes are a way of checking power. That's a bad. We're taxing the corporate bad. That's part of the reason that we tax corporations. In the 1960s, there was a Royal Commission in Canada, popularly known as the Carter Commission, that looked at taxation. And they said that, and these were, accountants and lawyers, they weren't radicals. They said taxes should be allocated according to economic power. And they advocated for business taxes for the same reason that most people see business taxes as basically like a bit of a fail-safe, that really we shouldn't tax business at all. We should tax the owners who collect the income from the business, but we're never going to get all of that. So we tax the businesses as a bit of a step into the loss that we would see otherwise. So it's a bit of a fail-safe. And I think that needs to go out with the modern inception of the corporation, that corporations really want to be legal persons when that serves their interest, and they want to be flow-through entities when that serves their purpose. Well, no, we don't exist in our own right. We're just, we're just kind of the avatar of the ownership class. Okay, well, if that's the case, then you don't get any of these other rights that are afforded to persons. Or if you want to be persons, you're a person. Let's tax you exactly the way that we would tax a person. I'm being a little bit facile here, but corporations are entities in their own right. They're not just the flow through, we're simply exercising the desires of the owners in a way. Yes, they are, because their profits are on their behalf, but corporations are making all kinds of qualitatively diverse decisions that affect all of us. And when they are highly profitable, that gives them more ability to do so. And often it's not in the interest of the population. So taxes need to remain on corporations because corporate power is a bad.
Corporate power is a bad. Interesting. Okay. Well, let's move on to the point of world government and the fact that it's not an elected body. I think this makes a lot of the citizenry around the world very nervous. What are your thoughts about the non-democratic nature of world governance?
It's obviously an issue. And this is, again, I talked about the issue with pensions. For me, is the kind of the getting from here to there of it all. Like, we can imagine democratically accountable global governance structures. And if we could just sort of wipe the existing governance structures clean and start with, everyone in the chat, Dan, you and I, we're going to design what global governance should look like. It could be fully democratic. The getting from here to there is the real tricky thing. Obviously, it should be more accountable. But right now, global governance is very, very beholden to powerful interests, specifically because of its non-democratic nature. And more mechanisms to make it less beholden to powerful interests would be better. What exactly are those? I'm not equipped to kind of get into some of that designed nitty gritty. I absolutely have the same concern, but I'm not willing to sacrifice the necessity of global governance institutions. I mentioned, I'm increasingly thinking about what could the positive, how do we keep the positive components of corporations? How do we keep the positive components of the Bretton Woods institutions? Like there are positive things that these organizations do, even though I was politicized with them very much as, enemies number 1 and 2, the IMF and the World Bank.
Nicely put. In your work, do you find that and specifically related to your work, does foreign policy or discussion outside of the borders of Canada come much into the conversation, or is it pretty much a domestic work, domestic policy?
So earlier when you mentioned, you use the longshoremen as your example, they don't give a shit about anyone other than their own members. And in a way, they shouldn't really have to. Their reason for existing is to support their members. At the same time, I would be surprised if that is true. I don't know the longshoreman organizational structure, but other unions do actually, and sometimes to the consternation of their members, work on broader matters. And so our organization, we're not a union, but we're a labor organization with unions as affiliates. Global human rights is a thing that gets time and attention from people within our organization, in part because if workers' interests abroad are served, we believe that will benefit workers at home as well. And having trade systems that actually benefit all parties is necessary and essential. Trade is a good thing. I was politicized in a movement that saw the way trade was being promoted in a negative way. And unfortunately, that led many of that cohort to view trade itself in a negative way. And we're starting to see, thankfully, some left progressive socialists, whatever you want to call it, rehabilitation of trade and the value of trade. So we think a lot about how trade should be done in a way that's actually beneficial to workers here, Canadians, of all sorts, and workers and people around the border. This does not have to be like trade is the perfect example of a non-zero sum game. People on both sides can be better off after the trade is performed.
Yeah. Let's give me an example of something you're really proud of that you've had a hand in shaping.
I would say that whatever influence myself and Canadians for Tax Fairness had as part of the discussion of the role of corporate pricing power in the latest bout of inflation, I'm not very humble about that. This idea was totally off the table for where is inflation coming from. And we put out a report when I was with Canadians for Tax Fairness this would have been early 2022. So inflation was really just starting to get worrisome. It was early. And our report showed corporate profits were already at record high levels, and that their pricing power, their ability to increase prices was already a factor in the inflation that we were seeing. And a poll, I don't know if one has been done in Canada, but a US poll showed that a plurality of Americans saw corporate pricing power as one of the major factors in the bout of inflation that we had. I've gotten to go on to Canadian mainstream media to talk about the latest inflation numbers and say corporate pricing power. And I got invited back. I didn't get laughed out of the room. This was accepted as, this is part of the story. Have we gotten the policies to respond to it that we should? No. And that is probably one of the biggest disappointments, but definitely proud of the part I have played in getting people to acknowledge that, the people who can set prices set them higher, and that's inflation. Yeah,
that's very, very interesting. From a macro standpoint, then I want to return to something that we talked about earlier, was it was the milieu in the middle, and I can't remember what term you used, but it was
mesoeconomics.
Meso, yeah. So is there a mix of industry that really make up the bulk of the macro. And I mean, like, um, housing and car production, and like there's certain things that, and I was kind of touching on this earlier. The small business guy, the small corporations are really, maybe on an aggregate they affect, um, they affect the whole, but for the large multinational corporations in industries like car manufacturing and pharmaceuticals, and you just, are there a certain number of sectors that really drive the a significant portion of the GDP in any given country?
Well, in Canada, obviously fossil fuels have been played a huge role in our economic performance. One of the things I kind of hoped we would talk about is an issue that I think we're going to be hearing a lot about in the coming months, and that's productivity. With the last, I'll get back to that. So, real estate is a major component of this. Fossil fuels are a major component of this. We still have a very sizable manufacturing sector, even if it's much smaller than it once was. Our economy is nowhere near as diversified as it should be, and the major role of fossil fuels has just been how important it is for the trade side of things. Like it's our major export, and we need those exports if we're wanting the imports. And there's no clear replacement for it at the moment. What will step in fossil fuels have been waning. They will continue to wane as quickly as they need to get our emissions where they are. Right now, it doesn't look like that, but they will wane. Sorry, I've totally lost track of what your question was. I led myself on some tangents. I apologize.
Well, I mean, don't worry, it happens to me all the time. These brain fluffs and everything. But I was saying, I'm trying to say, what are the top level drivers of GDP? And you went to say, well, a lot of it's fossil fuel related, right? Which I get that, but I'm saying the specific industries, because fossil fuels is a catch-all for everything, really. Okay, so auto industry, okay, pharmaceutical industry. What are the main drivers of the economies that really need to be examined? And I would say is going to be your biggest bang for your buck in terms of policy, forcing the corporations to comply with a greater social good. Because I'm trying to draw a distinction between the individual corporation and these enormous multinational corporations that really control the everything from government policy to the wealth accumulation in around the world, really, right? So what are those major industries? That's what I want you to focus on. What are the major industries that we need to examine and reform to have that revenue come back to us?
I'm going to take one further step back and to the side from thinking about the specific industries to the broad categories that are used to calculate GDP. You probably know the famous Y equals C plus I, blah, blah, blah. And the fact that we are very consumption-driven economies and investment has really waned. And one of the outcomes of this, people are claiming, is that our productivity has really, really fallen off. And I can show you, if you share the invest machinery and equipment chart.
Our production team is saying, which one is it?
There it is. That one. Okay, so first, note the log scale on the y-axis, but this is it's getting hard for me to follow my lines. The black line is gross business investment adjusted for inflation. And the red line is the trend of that from the first quarter of 1961 through the first quarter of 2008. So right before the global financial crisis. And you can see that it was fitful, but investment in machinery and equipment was trending upwards, like fairly significantly, and has absolutely flatlined since then. So we're not getting investment in productive capacity like we once were. You can take that down. Some people are going to say, oh, well, but the reason why we're not seeing the investment in the machinery and equipment is because now we're a much more digital economy. And so it's a lot more, virtual things. If you can share the invest intellectual property products chart, which was probably the source of the confusion about which one. Nope, that's the productivity, the OECD productivity ones. It'd be great if we get a chance to talk about that one. Nope, it's the one, it's called invest-intellectual-property-products.png. Although creating, I'm sure, there we go. What you can see is basically the exact same trend. You're seeing a bit more of an uptick, a slight trend up since 2018, I guess, but way below what our trend was for investment in these types of property products. So it's not that investment is just going into productive capacity other than the machinery that we use for production. So we've seen this huge fall off in investment, and in substitute for that,
what's the example of an intellectual property product? Because you're saying it's not machinery, but so what
so this software is intellectual properties of patents and stuff like that. This is a very tricky thing to measure within corporate financial reporting. You could probably take that down from the screen now. You only get intangible assets, which are not totally synonymous to these, but intangible assets are seen as being forms of productive capacity that aren't the machines, the equipment, the plants, the physical stuff that we use. But intangible assets only get onto the books in the course of an acquisition. So if I take out a trademark on my brand name and everyone recognizes that this brand name is worth billions of dollars to my company, it's not on the books unless someone buys my company, and then that becomes part of the goodwill, the difference between what the fair valuation of my company is just on what are all the value of the physical assets and then what I'm actually getting paid. So it's just that premium between if you just sold everything that makes up this company, the physical assets we have, and what's actually being paid for, that gets booked as goodwill. That becomes an intangible asset. That's the way that intangible assets get accounted for within standard financial accounting. So accounting for these things is exceedingly difficult. So be a little bit cautious about those numbers, but taking them as they are, you see this flatlining of investment in the actual productive capacity of our economy. And we've substituted more and more debt-driven consumption for that, a lot of it within our housing market, which has driven up the price of that class of assets. And in Canada, we're seeing all kinds of harmful effects coming out of that. So we really need some fundamental rethinks about what our economy needs to do and how it can do that in a just way. And getting back to a point I made earlier, we need to stop just trying to incentivize the private sector to make the investments we know need to be taken. And the public just needs to make these investments just like we did during World War II.
Okay, so you're like, this is interesting. I want to pick up on that point where you said it's like a debt-driven stimulus to show the increase in GDP is what we're seeing as a result. As what you're showing with the trend lines, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, what does this mean? I mean, so there's a less productive economy. And yet the GDP, the catch-all for GDP is now including things that are less production-centric, but we're still seeing growth. And that growth is kind of, in your opinion, a false growth because it's not pointing to real tangible assets, I guess, or output. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it's, and this moves back in the direction of your original question about, like what are the major sectors. The question came up the last time I was on degrowth. What do I make of degrowth? And I mostly try to avoid the debate because I think it just misses the key insight from both the green growth and the degrowth people, which is growth of what? What do we actually want more of? Where do we actually want our economy to develop? During World War II, we knew what we needed. We needed things to be able to fight the war, to be able to support our soldiers, to be able to, provide resources to our allies to fight the war. It's less clear for fighting the crises we have now, particularly the climate crisis, but it's not totally unclear. We know we need investment in clean energy production. We know we need investment in clean manufacturing. And these could all be done at orders of magnitude, much larger scale. And making that investment would show up in GDP as growth. And what we are actually be doing is trying to affect some qualitative transformation, because there are certain industries, particularly the high emission ones associated with fossil fuel extraction and refinement, that we know need to be sunsetted. These need to be, eventually totally gone. And there are industries of the future that can step into that place. And the private sector is just not going to get us there in a smooth way that provides people with, some certainty. A lot of what my organization is doing right now is trying to make sure that the workers in those industries that are going to, disappear don't bear the bulk of the cost from the reduction and elimination of those industries, because historically they are the ones that will. We have had resources bust in this country again and again and again, and it's always workers and their families in those communities that end up paying the major cost from that, while the people who have primarily benefited get away, invest in the new industry, and stay rich and get even richer.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that's really the polemic that you're fighting for, and the foundation of your career, your PhD, and the direction of the institute that you work with. Why don't you tell everybody what the institute is and what's on the timeline schedule for the
Canadian Labour Congress?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're a labor organization. If you belong to a union in Canada, there's a good chance that you also belong to the Canadian Labour Congress. And we do all kinds of policy advocacy. We will be looking at the budget closely. I'm spending a lot of time with this productivity issue because, so with the last monetary policy report, which accompanies some of the Bank of Canada's rate decisions, they stated very explicitly that one of the upside risks to inflation is that wages will continue to grow faster than productivity, which would put upward pressure on prices. So we're going to see this narrative leveraged against workers, that productivity in Canada is flatlining, so workers shouldn't expect to see wage gains until that productivity starts to increase again. Now, I call bullshit on it because we have seen decades of productivity gains far greater than wages. So why is it only now that wages need to be tied to productivity? Also, in the monetary policy report, the Bank of Canada itself says, well, actually, you can get higher wages without increased productivity if you take those wage gains out of profit margins. And we have profit margins far higher than they have been historically. So there's lots of room for corporations to give up some of their profits to increase the wages of workers. So I know this productivity narrative is coming for those who I work on behalf of, and I'm wanting to understand much more the measures of productivity, because our friend Blair Fix has written some really, really insightful, devastating analysis of just what a garbage measure aggregate productivity is. So trying to, engage in the discussion about productivity in a way that ensures workers aren't once again made to pay the price for something that's the outcome of, bad choices by firms and bad policy by government.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Okay, well, I want to. I'm getting a little virtual tap on the shoulder because sometimes I get carried away and pulled into the conversation, which is great. But I want to let everybody know that we're very thankful for the engagement for all of our listeners. We've had upwards of 3,000 viewers at some point in the show. Right now, we're just tracking at just over 2. And we want to thank all the regulars for showing up on their Saturday morning, at least where we are. I think there's a publication or something that goes out on Steve's channel that it's 12 noon or something in London, or 5 p.m. I think in London, and so there's people all over the world watching this. We want to thank you. Keep that engagement coming. Sunday morning for Tony. He must be in Australia. Give us a little shout out, Tony. Where are you from? And thanks for showing up on your Sunday morning. We really appreciate it. We're on Twitter. We're on LinkedIn. We're on YouTube, of course. So it's all on the Steve Keen channel on YouTube. Also on Steve's LinkedIn and his Twitter. So let's continue to show the love, even post show. Keep the comments going. We love them, and we always do our best to get back to you on that. Well, we got Douglas Dowell there. Thanks, Douglas. You're a wonderful guy. I've enjoyed talking to you. We want to have you back soon. So that thanks right back at you. We really appreciate it. Tony, Brisbane. There we go. He's from us. He's from down under, right? 3:43 a.m. Can you imagine that? That's great. That's really wonderful. Okay, we love you guys. Thank you very much. So we've got 15 minutes, DT, and I've been steering the conversation, and I'd like both of us to kind of wrap up the show. What do you think? Let's put a few things democratically on the table. What do you think? How should we tie a bow on this 2 hours of conversation?
I wish we'd had more time to get into the productivity narrative, because I'd actually like your thoughts as a philosopher about the metaphysics of these sorts of measures. I don't know how much you've ever looked at the work of my PhD supervisor, Blair Fix's PhD supervisor, Jonathan Nitzan. I mentioned him once already. He and his writing partner wrote this piece called, it's something about like the main bifurcations of political economy, one being between economy and politics, and power being relegated to the politics side, and the other one being between nominal and real. And so we take these nominal measures, just all denominated in dollars and cents, and then we make these adjustments for price changes to give us supposedly real measures. So you'll hear real GDP or real income. And so this is after adjusting for changes in prices. And this is, so I'm fully on board with them that these measures are not real. We need to stop calling them real, because what's real is what's nominal. What's real to me is what I see in my paycheck. What's real in terms of GDP is what's denominated in dollars and cents. That said, you do want to adjust for price changes for certain analytical purposes. Like I've been doing analyses on affordability for my job. And so I'm calculating what I call purchasing power, which is taking people's wages and adjusting it for the bout of inflation that we've seen. how much can their wages buy? They can't buy as much as they once could until they grow as much as prices have grown. So this is the type of analysis that does need to be done, but it is not anywhere near as clear cut as we pretend that it is. We don't think about what goes into constructing a price index. If I had my PhD to do all over again, I think I would write about the construction of price indexes. And I have sitting beside me 2 binders for 2 different price indexes that are essential to economic analyses. This is the binder for calculating the consumer price index, the famous CPI that you get headline inflation from. And that's the thickness of that binder. Then you have a lesser known series, the producer price index. And that's the thickness of the binder for constructing the producer price index. And this amount of effort has to go into actually constructing the price indexes that give us these supposedly real measures. And I think there are the metaphysical assumptions that are built into these processes, which again, they're very important. We need to do this, but we need critical analysis of the metaphysics that's involved in actually constructing these things, because I think they hide a lot of assumptions about how the economy works. And frankly, they've been incredibly influenced by neoclassical thinking, because economists have had a heavy hand in developing these things. And that type of thinking is just planted so firmly in their brains.
Well, how would I go into it? Well, as a philosopher, I emphasize more on the nobility of an individual person, so much more of a Socratic, Platonic philosopher, and the index I think is possibly helpful, but it's a bit of a runaway train, and tying it back to something substantial and real is going to be really important. I've been very bullish on the works of Peter Zeihan, and not to so much momentum within my colleagues and friends on the show, but I think he's incredibly insightful to have a starting point looking at the mix of demographics across a population in respect to one country versus another. And I think he's bang on by predicting the potential, I guess, the health of one country over another based off of where their productive capacity lies relative to that class of people, not class, to that age group of people, the demographics of people that do the production. And the interesting thing that how I process this as a philosopher is I look at this and I say, we're maybe talking about the wrong approach. The approach is we need to be able to reduce consumption, and the preoccupation that we have directed towards GDP is still central to the conversation. And until that narrative changes and we're no longer a production-centric society, we're in trouble. And so where I differentiate, where I kind of move away from Peter, and Peter's incredibly intuitive here, is it's like we can do it, but everybody has to do it. And hence maybe that's the point where the world government comes in, not on a plethora of actions, but a very simple, digestible direction that says everything changes in this particular direction. Okay, so let me give you an example. If you look at the retirement age, I guess the average well, maybe we'll start from the top. In Canada, the average lifespan of an individual is 80.75 years, 81.75 years. And it's, that's a very easy metric to look at. So that means if the average retirement age is 65, that means there's X number of years that people basically live off of the state, so to speak, right? Okay. if that went down to and we're using the wartime analogy in that particular, in the same, a similar sort of situation, there's an age group that is much smaller and a demographic that's much smaller that effectively will run the economy. And so I know you wanted to stay away from degrowth, but quite simply, it's simple math. We need to reduce the amount of production. We need to increase the quality of life. And by reducing the age of retirement, I think that's one of the key things to reset what's important. And I think that if individuals really examine themselves, if they really examined what's important, what do they need, what do they want, what sustains them, it's an inward looking piece. And until that normative understanding from every individual, whether you're the head of a corporation or you're a longshoreman, and my apologies to the longshoremen. Actually, hearing myself say that they're, I kind of want to recount that a little bit. They're not in any way evil or anything, but my point is that the normative structure needs to change, and the whole mentality of production needs to change. We need to move away from a production-centric society. And so this may sound like a virtue signal, but it is. It's the one virtue signal and the ethic that should be impregnated, that moves forward for everybody in society. And that's what needs to take place. Not through government policy. It needs to come intrinsically from the individual. So that's how I would summarize it in that. And does the government have a role? Absolutely. Don't force people to work till 65. Have it stop at 40. And you say, that's ridiculous. And I'm like, you know what? Volunteer. Do the things that you need to do. Like the pandemic maybe gave us an opportunity to look at that. Spending more time with the families, creating a podcast like we're doing here, exploring literature, reading economic books. Heck, if you have more free time, become a scholar. We live in a golden age of information, so it's at your disposal to use it. And I think that is an incredible gift, and we're not leveraging it to its full capacity of personal productivity, which equals learning, which equals developing yourself, the individual, as a noble creature on the planet, which is justice and temperance.
Well, at the maybe the potential disconnect or the bridge between what I'm interested and concerned with and what you're talking about is the role of measurement, which in the last, I would say, 15 years has really become a major buzzy focus, the data-driven self, and that if it matters, you measure it. And I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, there are many things, obviously, that are incredibly important to us that we just simply couldn't measure. At the same time, for collective entities, measurement is the way that we can construct some universals and understand things at scale, because qualitatively, there's no way of accounting for the almost 40 million people that live in this relatively small country. Like, we're a small country and we're 40 million people. And the only way we can capture us and our well-being is through measurement, and trying to make those measures as good as we possibly can. Having a multitude of measures is absolutely essential. And I would also say, rather than focusing, we need to move away from a production society, think about what all of these measures really began for, which is to think about well-being. All of this is supposed to be about our well-being. And even neoclassical economics starts from, how do we maximize people's well-being? Now, they adopt a metaphysical conception of human nature that I think is fundamentally flawed, and its adherents seem to have zero curiosity about actually digging into, or those that do rather end up becoming defectors of the faith because they realize how flawed this conception of human nature is, and that once you make it a bit richer, then the whole theory is clearly built on sand and it becomes meaningless. But that well-being should be what we're talking about when we're talking about economics. These are the processes of production and distribution and consumption that are making us better off. And a lot of where it has gone wrong is because of things that haven't been measured. So Joan Robinson had this quip that the only thing worse than being exploited by capitalism is not being exploited at all. And my sort of twist on that is the only thing worse than being priced by capitalism is not being priced at all. Because if you're not priced at all, your price is effectively set to zero. And so destroying you has no effect on us. And for a long time, we've allowed many very valuable things to be effectively priced at zero. We've destroyed entire cultures with unique languages that had perspectives on the world that are gone forever because we didn't apply any value that was meaningful to those who were deploying the money and the guns.
That's interesting. My mind went in that situation. Wasn't so much the lost languages, but as you were bringing up the point before you brought up the lost languages, I'd thought about, and it's not a sexist thing. It's a family unit and not properly rewarding, for example, a stay-at-home mom, and it could be a stay-at-home dad. It doesn't really matter. But the value of that, non-productive or measured entity in a family structure is at home a power imbalance, right? I mean, if the stay-at-home mom or father actually got compensated at a rate that was reflective of the amount of work that they put into a family unit that's required to raise a children and make a family cohere, we're that's the nucleus, I believe. And from there, the other nucleus is going to be industries like education. Why are the teachers of our societies grossly underpaid in relation to other professions? Right. That's another key thing. And quite possibly the cult of Asclepius. It's the dying words of Socrates. It's I owe a cock to Asclepius. And what is that? That's I owe this to the thinkers and the basically the thinkers of human health. That's what I owe my time of suffering on this planet to, is the collective wisdom of what makes for institutions of health and prosperity, right? And so you see, I think it's my advice is to keep these policies really simple, heuristically driven, so that people can understand and replicate them intuitively in a felt experience. That's what I would say. And I'm going to give you one DT with some intellectual love. I want to pass the baton on to you. You get the closing response on whatever you want to say, so that when you pause, we're going to say goodbye. So you get it, DT. The floor is yours. From one DT to another, DT, take it away and close up shop.
I'm going to close it up just with a thank you for the invitation once again to join the show. Obviously it was a great thrill for me the first time I got to do this, because Steve was a major influence on my thinking as an economist. And so there was part of me that was disappointed to know that he wasn't going to be able to join us today. But I really enjoyed this conversation because it allowed me to to think a little bit more deeply about the empirical stuff that I do. I do just very empirical analysis, and I think I do so. Hopefully, I do so in a way that's, you know, unique and creative and providing some value to my employer and ideally our affiliates and the workers that they represent, and hopefully all Canadians, because I think fighting for the policies that my organization fights for will make this a better Canada. But the ability to go even a bit further and think about these things a bit more abstractly and get some challenge in a friendly way. It's never it never feels combative, but you will push on things that I haven't necessarily thought of. And when you're trying to think big things, stuff gets missed. Necessarily so. And I would really just encourage everyone to not be afraid of not having all of the answers and to just sounding things out. I will say things here that, you know, if you invite me back, I may say the exact opposite because my thinking will continue to evolve, I hope. So thank you for having me here. Thank you for everyone who has been commenting. I will definitely try to take a look at all of these comments later and let them challenge some of my thinking.
Happy Easter weekend, guys. We're out of here. Thanks.